So hi, my name is Maggie Sheffer. I teach at Castlemont High School. And I teach 11th grade English. I teach an untracked class, and I also teach AP English Language, an open enrollment class that's an elective. So I actually get the honor of seeing some of my students twice a day, both in English 11 and then again in AP. My inquiry focus is just on English 11. Just to give a little bit of context, my students, when they come to me in 11th grade, tend to be really strong in critical thinking, but often arrive 1 or more years behind in grade level. And one of my big challenges is to help them access complex texts at the same time as helping them feel comfortable and help it feel accessible, while also not babying them through the process and taking away the actual thinking about the text by over-scaffolding. Also, 1 in 5 of my students is an English language learner, and that doesn't include students who've been redesignated, so those students are at some CELT level, and I try to address that, as I'll talk about later, with my focal students. My inquiry focuses on close reading of a rigorous text or a complex text, which is explicitly called out by the Common Core standards, and is a big challenge for us moving forward, because I want to continue to help my students access texts. You can see some of the texts we tend to read in 11th grade there. The Woman Warrior and Malcolm X are 2 that I'm going to talk about. And I want to help students access those texts in a deeper way. And I chose to focus on this because students in my class have a lot of practice analyzing, but they don't tend to get as deep as I'd like them to get. Specifically because when I'm writing the prompt, they're really well trained to find evidence, but it's the evidence that's the most obvious, the best fit, kind of shallow evidence that seems to match exactly. So they don't often look for areas of confusion or complexity or nuance. They tend to avoid those because they don't fit as well. So I wanted to look at ways to help my students create deeper analysis for these complex texts, but not to over-scaffold it so that I was doing that work for them. One of my colleagues, Candace Valenzuela, actually suggested leveled questions as an avenue to use for close reading, and I didn't know much about it, so I got a lot of these tools from her, but they ended up being a pretty strong fit. You can see in one of the handouts that I accidentally passed away, you can see a description of the 3 levels. It's okay, thank you.
They mean that.
Yes, the 3 levels, the first level is say, literal interpretation, the answer is right there in the text, there's no inference involved. Level 2, which I describe to students as the mean level, includes inference and looking for clues in the text. It still involves a lot of evidence, but it's a little bit more nuanced. And level 3, I describe to students as the matter level, and that involves evaluating and connecting to concepts or judgments outside of the text. So in order to help students begin to analyze text more deeply, I started by teaching them these levels of questions, and we practiced identifying different questions at different levels, and also evaluating which were the best questions. We did a lot of identification before students started to write. And the process that I ended developing as we used level questions was a 3-step process that's also devised or described on that handout. And students, kind of going back to our last presentation from Leah, the more regularly I used it, the more students became comfortable with those questions. So repetition seemed really, really powerful to me. But the 3-step process was that after reading a complex text individually or collaboratively, students would annotate with levels of questions, all 3. So not just level 3, but 1, 2, and 3 to help them kind of track all their questions down as they were reading, and to also push them to think at all 3 levels, because I could assign them certain levels of questions to write at to make sure they could track their thinking. So students would annotate with questions, and then step 2 was to host a discussion in a small group of 4. So after reading, students would present their question to a small group, and they would be responsible for not answering that question, but for facilitating a discussion on that question. So they'd have to record responses from their peers and also push back if their question wasn't really getting answered. So rather than me timing them, they would decide when the discussion ended, and they would give permission for the next person to talk. And that actually became really important because I tend to see a lot of people not quite have time to answer their questions or not be able to push. So that was one thing we worked a lot on, was pushing back if your question wasn't sufficiently answered. And then step 3 was to actually choose the juiciest question, the one that had provoked the richest discussion, to be the question that students would respond to. Sometimes I had students in a group choose the same question, so they had to vote and pick the best one. Other times they could choose different ones. But I found that the element of evaluation helped them really work for choosing a strong question and developing better questions in the first place. The process is also kind of illustrated up there, but we use these steps again and again. Writing questions, talking about them, and writing about them. And to examine how this was working, I chose 2 focal students. I had a third, but attendance became an issue. My first focal student, who I'm calling L, is very advanced in English. He's also enrolled in my AP English class, so I see him twice a day. He's very comfortable in my class. He's a very fluent reader and writer and thinker, but he's also often a little bit lazy because he gets a lot of validation in my class and he gets the right answer a lot, so his analysis can be kind of weak or formulaic or repetitive. I wanted to choose the student L to look at both what he was doing, to give me some clues into how I could help others feel more comfortable reading these complex texts, but also to see how I could push him to do stronger analysis and to look for areas of nuance where he wasn't understanding things, and to push him to make more bold, original arguments about the text as opposed to just the right answer. My second focal student is kind of the opposite side. He's focal student A. He's an English language learner currently at CELT level 2. He tries every assignment but doesn't feel a lot of success in my class. He often gets the wrong answer, gets a lot of red marks on his paper. Our conversations are often about how I can support him and how I'm struggling to support him and how to get him more engaged as opposed to validating conversations. He consistently tries, but visibly struggles with reading and writing and doesn't appear comfortable. I chose A because I want to learn how to support him better, and I know this is a task that makes almost all of us uncomfortable, reading a really difficult text and making arguments about it. And I wanted to use him as an example to think about how questions could help validate the questions he was obviously already feeling and make some of his confusion actually an asset as opposed to a deficit. I also wanted to examine how much struggle is actually productive. Like, is there a level of struggle where I'm just doing it for struggle's sake, or is it actually helping students learn? So I wanted to look at him as a case study to see if he shut down or to see if he responded. So through looking at data, I found some very interesting things, many of them positive. Student L, my student who is more advanced and also in the AP class, he did increase his depth of analysis through this process, but he felt extremely uncomfortable during it. He got really vocally frustrated. He would put his head down. He did not like not knowing the right answer. He was actually doing the best analysis I'd ever gotten from him. I was really, really happy about it, but he hated every minute of it. So that became my real finding about him, was that as struggle went up, comfort went down, but also the quality of the work went way, way up. And that led me to one of my next steps, which is to talk more about confidence, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Student A was extremely interesting because he met most of my indicators in really surprising ways. Because he was devising his own questions, which was one of my indicators. I actually skipped this. My indicators are exactly the same as the steps. So can students write questions? Can they discuss them at length? And can they write about them? He was able to write questions that were relevant to the text. He was able to discuss them in a group, and he was also able to write about them in ways that surface themes of the books. So while he was not successful, or it was very difficult for me to assess whether he was successful in answering questions I produced, he was much more able to show what he knew by generating his own ideas from the text, which led me to my findings. In general, I found that engagement went way up in terms of class discussions about a difficult text when students were writing the questions, which seems obvious, but was really important for me to look at in data, that when students write the questions, they're more engaged. Also, student ownership of those questions in the process of class went way up. So when students are writing about questions they've developed, they were working harder on their work because they owned those questions. And like I said, depth of analysis did in general go up because students were asking questions they genuinely didn't know the answer to, so their responses became more nuanced and they were addressing more interesting parts of the same text because they were drawn to the more interesting parts of the text as opposed to the right answer part of the text. My biggest, I think, understandings, though, came from looking at using these writings in response to their own questions as a form of assessment, because I'm used to reading 100 answers to the same question that I developed and just having 100 answers that are either right or wrong, and leading to some not very productive conversations with students about wrongness. However, it was very much more exciting to get 100 different readings of the same text with very different things that I could tell students were interested in or that they were wondering about or that they were genuinely pulling from the text. This was especially true for student A because often when I would propose a question to him, he would kind of pull the keywords from my question and provide an answer, and it was very difficult to tell what he was actually getting, if he was getting his ideas from the question or from his own understanding, because language became such a barrier that I couldn't tell if he was only getting his responses from the question itself. Whereas when he was writing his own questions, I could tell that he was surfacing these major themes and ideas because I wasn't telling them to him. So even though language was still a barrier, I could tell the ideas that he was getting. Also, it was much more asset-based, so it led to some much more fruitful conversations with students because I was able to say, oh, I see that you're getting this, what about this? As opposed to, you didn't get this, or you missed this again, or like, think deeper, which is not very useful feedback. And also it's useful to me in planning because now I know what students are interested in and I know what they're wondering and I can circle back and address some of those wonderings, whole class or in small discussions or through supplementary materials even. I don't think I have much time to talk about how it compares to other close reading protocols, but I'm a member of OUSD's PD that's working on close reading right now too, and it's very interesting to contrast what this approach asks of students to some other methods that are also called close reading, but ask some very cognitively different things of students. I'd love to talk about that more. But in terms of my next steps, I think my next steps are to think more about how confidence plays a role in this, because while I feel like this is worth doing, I feel like it could be a lot more successful if I framed it better and had a more whole class discussion about what it feels like to do bold original analysis and how uncomfortable that can feel, and validated some of student L's frustration. That's the end. Thank you.
You just hold up a zero? Yeah, I guess I killed it. Sorry.
Wonderful. I think we have tons of questions as right now. Can anybody want to start us off?
So I was going to ask a couple questions, but you opened this up at the end. So you're involved in this big giant thing at OUSD and close reading, and yet you design a project that's not using those protocols, yet a different protocol. Why?
So the times were kind of mismatched. I had started to do my data collection and interaction, and then a few weeks later, I was like, yay, I'm going to get more information on close reading. Some of the approaches are very similar to what I did with different names. And again, I didn't develop leveled questions, so I just applied it to close reading. Some were very different. So one of the approaches we studied as part of OUSD's Common Core ELA team was text-dependent questions, which very much puts the onus on the teacher for developing, to develop the question. It's like very specific on what kind of questions are valid or not, which is interesting because it removes student feedback at all from that discussion. Still hopefully leading to the same result of deep, thoughtful looking at a text, but very much more directed. So obviously I'm kind of a convert to letting students write the questions at this point and want to continue that. Other methods were more aligned to leveled questions. One was Text Complexity, which is a book that we read and looked through and advocates for multiple readings and is more students can kind of read what they will, no right answer. It's more aligned, but still does not explicitly call out leveled questions or a scaffold for questioning. So there's some approaches that are similar or different.
So my question is more about like the daily routine.
Yeah.
Right? So first, like, do you have your kids for block three?
No, I have them for about an hour a day, except for on Wednesdays.
So every day they're writing questions, discussing them, and they're writing a longer.
For 2 text-based units. So I did this strategy essentially for most days, not every single day, semi-daily, for a unit on 2 books, The Woman Warrior and Malcolm X. And they did also have final projects on those units, so the calendar did get a little bit hazier. But during our normal reading time and building up to those final projects, this was their daily routine, and also a way they gathered evidence and ideas to build up to those final projects. Yes.
So in regards to assessment,
Mm-hmm.
are you assessing, what are you assessing, how often, and how?
I was assessing mostly step 3, their final formal written paragraphs. And I'm really interested to connect this to what Leah said, because I did grade them. I straight up graded them. And I counted some as quizzes, and I counted some as assignments, and I'd let them know which were the practice ones and which were the quiz ones. I don't think that was necessarily married to the model I was using, more just how I'm used to grading. So I'm not sure that's the most effective way to do that.
I'm just gonna cycle one more time back to this. Do you think if you had made all the questions yourself, that the students would have gotten out of this what they did?
No, I've taught the exact same book before and it was not as engaging. And I also couldn't tell what was engaging to students or not because I was asking the questions. So very much no. I've had a lot, particularly with the woman warrior, I've had a lot of trouble engaging students in that text because it's very difficult. And I feel like having students embrace that difficulty was actually really great because they were being rewarded for what they didn't know or had questions about. And it gave us the next step in our conversation.
Could you talk a little bit more, so you talked about your thinking about productive struggle
Mm-hmm.
and about confidence, and
Yes.
how you're thinking about those, and I'm also, there might be other ideas, but I'm wondering about, you're thinking about confidence of if any of that was comfort as well, thinking about student L. So confidence and productive struggle, how your thinking is moving forward on that, and whether or not there's other things that work with confidence.
I think one way to answer your question is to notice the flip-flop in student L and A. So the student who normally didn't feel comfortable in my class at all actually showed work that showed me he was actually a lot more comfortable with this method than he normally was. Whereas student L, who's normally validated for getting the right answer and being really quick with his work and finishing early, he really struggled with it and his comfort level went down. So I feel like when given a task that they both had an entry level too, but they awarded different ways of thinking about class. So I would say that confidence and comfort are connected. Does that answer your question?
I think, yeah, I'm thinking
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, because it sounds like it's
Yeah.
student L who became less comfortable because he or she was used to a particular way of being able to perform in your classroom, right? And then the student was an A, and if they became more comfortable, sounds like was also gaining confidence.
I would agree with that. And I also think it's interesting to note the dismatch, the lack of matching between actual work produced, because both students produced work that I saw as a huge improvement. Student A felt that as comfort and confidence, whereas student L didn't realize he was doing well.
I love what you said about giving the role of the student who came up with their question, the job of being the facilitator, and then pushing back if they weren't really answering their question. I was wondering how you train them to do that. That's a hard thing to challenge your peers to give you more information back to the text.
We did some modeling, which was really fun. We did some bad discussions and some good discussions. Also, I had students pause and look at the responses they'd written down and gauge whether or not they were ready to go back and write a deep answer to that question. And if they weren't ready, they should ask more questions. They should push back. So kind of looking at whether they were ready for step 3 became our judgment for whether they were ready. Also, we talked somewhat about how close reading means multiple readings. So if you got one answer and everybody's like, oh, I agree with that, that's not quite enough. We want to have multiple interpretations. So pushback for a sentence stem I provided was, how else could we read this? Or what else could the answer be? Or is there another way to look at this? So pushing for multiple interpretations before I kept trying to fight that right answer impulse. So keep trying to find other possible answers.
Part of your feedback and assessment on the questions itself, because I guess when I think about doing this, I would worry that they see that the harder question to write, the more work they're going to have to do in writing and an extended piece of writing in response to it. So how do you maintain the drive to really write a level 3 challenging question?
I think genuine interest was actually the biggest motivator because students really wanted the answers. And I think this followed hopefully a heated discussion where they'd had some debate. So they had a lot of ideas going and they were actually asked to pick the juiciest questions. So hopefully whatever was most in their mind, most nagging them was the one they wrote about. I actually pushed the judgment of the questions back up to students. In this image you can see a list of questions up there. So that was one of our days earlier in practice when students had developed, say, 10 or so questions as a group. They shared them all together. They picked the best one and put it on the board, and other groups had to choose from those questions. So we did a lot of evaluation of questions, and I kept talking about the juiciest one, the one with the most controversy, the one you really weren't sure about. And the same process of judgment was used in the small groups. So you'd talk about all the questions, and then you'd pick the one that you felt was the strongest. It didn't even have to be one you wrote, but that judgment was part of the daily routine.
So again, about the questioning.
Yeah.
I would think that that would actually be a struggle, that
Mm-hmm.
the kids would be really able to judge, was it a 2 or 3 in particular?
Mm-hmm.
And then, would they ever then create questions that were unanswerable, that actually weren't questions that you can answer from the text? Or was that not one of the things they struggled with in trying to create a quote-unquote hard or difficult?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about how to, like, was there a rubric for questions? Did you talk about depth of knowledge level? Like, how did you help them pigeonhole 2 from 3?
Great question. A lot of that's kind of built into these particular levels, and one thing I really like about Costa's levels is that they're not actually saying that a 3 is the best type of question. They're saying that thinking at all 3 levels means you're deeply thinking. So you should be kind of bouncing around between all of them. And in fact, text-dependent questions are actually level 2, so they're the ones that are really deep into the text and not applying to your own life. In terms of did they ever ask a question that couldn't be answered by the text, they asked many questions where there was no one definitive answer, but none that went so far beyond that I had to pull them back. And I did use non-models sometimes. Like, what if Malcolm X was an astronaut is not actually a level 3 question. So we did some look at non-models as a whole class to kind of stave some of that off. I can't think of an instance where I had to pull them back. And often as warm-ups or do-nows, I'd present a list of questions and have them level them and choose the strongest. Level them and choose the strongest. Mm-hmm. Hi.
Did you ever use that level 3 questions and answers as a prompt for a longer essay?
Ooh, that's great. With the woman warrior, they had a chance to choose one of their older prompts to expand. It was more of an in-class timed. It was not their final essay, so they could take an older one and go back and expand. I think that's a great area for further study and something I'd like to look at when I long-term plan for next year, because the one issue of coming up with this strategy I was really married to mid-year was that I already had a long-term plan in place and final projects that this didn't necessarily mesh with. So as I look towards next year, it'd be a nicer goal to build this in from the beginning and to think about how to make it a longer-term goal.
Last question. Yeah.
Hi.
I'm curious about student L,
Mm-hmm.
and any thoughts you have about how you might move him to the place of being comfortable and actually understanding that he is achieving more, you know, and being able to move away from that. Right answer is the way to go.
I'm sure there is a way to address it whole class, but I'd really like to start by having a conference with Elle to talk it through and maybe practice what I'd say to a whole class first. Because I think if I could sit with him in his work and talk about what I admired about it and what was so great about it, that would probably be the best way to use his work as a starting point, because he did have amazingly strong work, and I think he'd be very proud of that. And maybe use that as a model for how I could go back and reframe for the entire class. So before the end of the year, I'd like to get him sitting down and talk about it.
Well, this is amazing. We have to take a short break. The connection between the first 2 presentations is phenomenal. And thinking about your question about the desire to improve, and then not formally grading the work and thinking about how you inspire student engagement, and your last comments about Elle, how amazing his work was.